Nikolai Petrov just called this waitress a pathetic servant with peasant hands in Russian. He had no idea she understood every word. What she said back in perfect St. Petersburg dialect didn't just humiliate him. It saved him from a $400 million trap set by his own business partner. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not to the public humiliation that would soon go viral. Not to the staggering $400 million betrayal that would shatter lives and fortunes. But to a cramped studio apartment in the Bronx, where a brilliant young woman sat alone at 3 in the morning, forced to choose between refilling her mother's insulin prescription or paying the next semester's tuition. Her name is Daisy Bennett, 26 years old, a graduate student at Columbia University pursuing a Master's in Slavic linguistics. She is fluent in Russian, Ukrainian, Czech, and Polish, with a thesis examining the evolution of aristocratic dialect in St. Petersburg Russian between 1850 and 1917. Night after night, she studied until her eyes burned, highlighter trembling in her hand, fighting exhaustion and mounting medical bills. What the Columbia faculty never suspected was that Daisy's command of Russian ran far deeper than any classroom. Her grandmother, Elena Volkov, had escaped St. Petersburg during the Revolution and raised Daisy speaking only Russian until she was 7 years old. As a result, Daisy didn't just speak the language, she spoke it like the old aristocracy. A flawless, cultured cadence that even native speakers from modern Russia could rarely match, let alone imitate. And tonight, that rare gift was about to pull her into a world of deception, power, and unimaginable stakes she never saw coming. Friday night, October 17th. The Obsidian Room, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, a fortress of black marble and smoked glass where a single dinner costs what most people earn in a month. The average meal here runs $850 per person. Reservations sit on a 6-month wait list. The clientele moves in a world of private jets, hedge funds, and political backrooms, billionaires, A-list celebrities, senators who never pay their own tab. The staff. They are ghosts in crisp black uniforms, trained to anticipate every need before it's spoken, existing only to make the powerful feel more powerful. Daisy Bennett had been one of those ghosts for 8 months. 3 nights a week she traded her textbooks for a starched apron, earning $15 an hour plus tips that rarely covered the gap. Her phone buzzed in the locker room as she buttoned her uniform. The screen glowed with a single message from her mother. Insulin prescription ready. $340, need by Monday. She stared at the number until it blurred, then slipped the phone into her pocket and walked out onto the floor. The floor manager, Mr. Henderson, a man in his 50s whose forehead seemed permanently creased with worry, intercepted her near the service station. Table 7 tonight, he said, voice low. Nikolai Petrov, Russian real estate, net worth $4.7 billion. He tips 40% when everything is perfect. He ends careers when it is. Bennett, you're assigned. Daisy's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, the briefest recognition of the name. She nodded once and moved toward the station to prepare the table settings. Nikolai Petrov, 48 years old. Born in a crumbling Moscow apartment block, he clawed his way to New York in the 90s and built one of the largest private real estate empires on the East Coast. Venture capital followed. Forbes had put him on their cover 3 times. The headlines always carried the same undertones: ruthless negotiations, hostile takeovers, a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in his path. He demanded perfection and punished anything less with surgical precision. To the world, he was a self-made titan. To the people who served him, he was something colder. A man who saw waitstaff, drivers, assistants as furniture, useful until they weren't, then discarded without a second thought. He spoke to them in clipped commands, never eye contact, never gratitude. Contempt was his default setting for anyone he considered beneath him, and in his world almost everyone was. Tonight he would sit at table 7 expecting the usual deference. Tonight he would order his preferred vodka chilled to exactly -18 degrees Celsius, his steak rare, his conversation uninterrupted. Tonight he would look across the table at the woman pouring his wine and see nothing but another invisible servant. And tonight, Nikolai Petrov was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He was about to underestimate a waitress. At 8:47 p.m., Nikolai Petrov walked through the doors of the Obsidian Room, and the entire restaurant shifted. The air changed. Conversations quieted by half a decibel. Heads turned just enough to register his arrival without appearing to stare. Waitstaff straightened spines they didn't know were slouched. Even the sommelier paused mid-pour. Nikolai moved like gravity bent around him, 6'3", broad-shouldered, charcoal Brioni suit cut sharp enough to draw blood. No tie. Open collar revealing a single heavy platinum chain. His presence demanded attention the way a storm front demands silence. He wasn't alone. On his right walked Isabella Vance, the supermodel whose face had launched 1,000 magazine covers and whose personal brand was valued at $90 million. Blonde hair swept into an effortless updo, emerald gown clinging like liquid. On his left, Julian Thorne, hedge fund manager, Nikolai's supposed business partner and financial advisor. Julian wore the uniform of new money trying to pass for old, navy suit, pocket square, perpetual half-smile that never reached his eyes. For 6 months, Julian had been quietly positioning assets, forging documents, and whispering to the right offshore accounts. He planned to betray Nikolai and walk away with a 9-figure exit. What Julian didn't know was that the waitress now approaching their table was about to unravel everything. Daisy reached table 7, menus balanced perfectly, professional smile locked in place. "Good evening. Welcome to the Obsidian Room. My name is Daisy and I'll be—" Nikolai didn't look up from his phone. Without lifting his eyes, he spoke to Julian in rapid, aristocratic Russian. "Look at this waitress. I bet she doesn't even know how to hold a wine bottle properly." Daisy understood every syllable. The cadence, the old Petersburg inflections, her grandmother's exact dialect, but her face remained serene. She de-learned long ago that people reveal their truest selves when they believe you cannot understand them. She waited a beat, then continued in flawless English. "Can I start you with something to drink this evening?" Nikolai laughed, low and mocking, and switched to Russian again, addressing Isabella this time. "She probably thinks we're talking about the weather, Americans, always so eager to please." Isabella gave a practiced chuckle. Julian smirked and glanced at his watch. For the next 20 minutes, Nikolai kept it up, every comment in Russian, every barb sharpened for amusement. "Her posture is tragic. Did they teach her nothing in whatever village she crawled out of? Watch, she'll spill the water like the clumsy peasant she is. I should order caviar just to see if she knows how to pronounce it." Each insult landed softer on his companions than it did on the woman refilling their glasses, yet Daisy never flinched. She poured, she nodded, she answered in polite English when spoken to directly. Her silence was a weapon Nikolai couldn't see. The table laughed louder with every jab. Isabella leaned in, delighted. Julian played along, hiding his own calculations behind the performance. And Daisy listened, every word, every sneer, every casual cruelty delivered in the language of the aristocracy she had inherited. She remembered her grandmother's voice. "They think silence is weakness, Dachka. Let them. Silence is how you survive until the moment is right." The moment was coming. As Daisy moved silently around the table placing appetizers, seared foie gras for Nikolai, tuna tartare for Isabella, crab salad for Julian, the insults sharpened into something deliberate, almost theatrical. While she uncorked and decanted the requested 2015 Chateau Margaux, Nikolai leaned back, swirling his existing glass, and spoke in that same aristocratic Russian drawl, loud enough for the whole table but not the rest of the room. "I wonder what she earns in a place like this. Probably barely enough for a roach-infested room in whatever slum she calls home. Maybe she shares it with 3 other girls and a mattress on the floor." Isabella gave a small, performative giggle and responded in Russian, her tone light but edged with discomfort. "Nikolai, stop. She's just doing her job." Nikolai waved a dismissive hand, eyes still fixed on his phone. "People like her are born to serve people like us. It's the natural order, some fetch, some command. She should be grateful we even let her near the table." Daisy's hand remained perfectly steady as she poured water into their glasses, one measured ounce at a time. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. But the words kept coming, each one testing the thin membrane of her restraint. She remembered her grandmother Alina sitting beside her on the narrow Bronx couch, voice soft and certain in the same flawless Petersburg Russian. "Daisy, language is power. To know a person's language is to know their soul. And when they speak it thinking you are deaf to it, that is when you see the soul most clearly. Never forget that, Dachka." The memory anchored her. She breathed through it, kept moving, kept serving. Then came the main courses. Daisy approached with a heavy silver tray balanced on one shoulder, Nikolai's Wagyu ribeye, seared rare black truffle shavings glistening on top. She set the plate in front of him with practiced grace, stepping back to allow him to inspect it. Nikolai glanced down at the dish, then up at her hands as she adjusted the placement of his knife and fork. His lip curled. He spoke again in Russian, this time projecting so Isabella and Julian could share the joke. "Look at those hands. Rough, red, cracked at the knuckles. Peasant hands. I bet her mother was a cleaning lady scrubbing toilets in some midtown office building, and her father drank himself to death in whatever filthy hole they crawled out of. Probably both dead now, leaving her to play waitress and pretend she belongs here." The table went quiet for half a second. Isabella's smile faltered. Julian raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Nikolai waited for the laugh that didn't come, then shrugged and reached for his fork. That was the moment something inside Daisy finally cracked, not with tears, not with anger that showed on her face, but with cold, surgical clarity. Nikolai Petrov had just made two critical errors in the span of a single sentence. First, he had insulted her mother, the woman currently lying in a hospital bed in the Bronx, fighting the slow amputation of her left foot because the insulin was always 3 days late and the bills were always 2 months behind. The woman who had worked double shifts at the laundromat until her kidneys failed, who still called Daisy every night to ask if she had eaten, who never once complained about the pain. Second, he had assumed Daisy was powerless to respond, that her silence was surrender, that her uniform made her invisible in every way that mattered. He was wrong on both counts. Daisy straightened. Her posture shifted by perhaps half an inch, but the change was absolute. She looked directly at Nikolai for the first time, not as a waitress regarding a guest, but as a woman regarding a man who had just crossed a line he could never uncross. The restaurant noise continued around them, clinking silverware, murmured conversations, the soft hiss of the kitchen pass. But at table 7 the air felt suddenly thinner. Nikolai finally looked up, meeting her eyes. He smirked, expecting deference, apology, retreat. What he got instead was the beginning of something he would never forget. Daisy set down the last plate with deliberate care, the final touch of the service, a small porcelain dish of amuse-bouche for Julian. She stood up straight, her posture transforming from deferential shadow to unyielding presence. For the first time that evening, she looked directly at Nikolai Petrov, her eyes locking onto his with the quiet intensity of someone who had just decided the game was over. She responded in flawless, aristocratic St. Petersburg Russian, the pure, rolling cadence of pre-revolutionary nobility, untouched by the grit of modern Moscow streets. "Mr. Petrov," she said, her voice carrying like a bell through fog, "I must say your accent betrays provincial origins. Moscow, I assume, perhaps some working-class district on the outskirts where the snow piles up against crumbling Soviet blocks." The table went completely silent. Nikolai's fork, laden with a perfect bite of wagyu, stopped midway to his mouth, suspended in the air like a frozen pendulum. Isabella's eyes widened, her manicured hand pausing over her wine glass. Julian leaned back in his chair, the half-smile evaporating from his face as he recalculated the evening's risks. Across the restaurant, Mr. Henderson froze mid-stride, his panicked gaze darting toward table 7 like a man watching a grenade pin slip free. For 5 full seconds, nobody breathed. The weight of it pressed down, the sudden reversal, the exposure of a man who had built his empire on the assumption that no one would ever call him out. Daisy continued in Russian, her voice calm and cultured, each syllable laced with the effortless authority of old bloodlines. "My grandmother fled St. Petersburg in 1918. The Volkov family, perhaps you've heard of them. They owned 3 factories along the Neva and a mansion on Nevsky Prospect with ballrooms that echoed under crystal chandeliers. She taught me this language before I could walk, and she taught me that true aristocracy isn't bought with billions, it's carried in the bones." Nikolai's face shifted, shock hardening into something rower. Humiliation, the color draining from his cheeks as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a retort from a waitress. It was a mirror held up to his carefully constructed facade, reflecting back the boy from the provinces he had spent decades burying under layers of wealth and intimidation. She leaned in slightly, just enough to invade the invisible barrier of his personal space, her tone dropping to a velvet-edged whisper still in that impeccable Russian. "As for my hands, yes, they're rough. Red from the hot water, cracked from the bleach. From washing dishes after midnight shifts to pay for my mother's insulin, the kind that keeps her alive another month if we're lucky. But my hands are honest. They've earned every callus. I wonder if you can say the same about yours. Hands that sign deals in shadows, that crush lives for a percentage point. Hands stained not by labor, but by something far dirtier." She straightened then, the professional smile returning to her lips like a mask slipping back into place, serene and impenetrable. The table remained frozen, the air thick with the aftershock. Then Daisy delivered her final line in Russian, clear enough to cut through the murmur of the dining room. "Enjoy your meal, gentlemen. And next time you want to talk about someone serving you, remember, we're not deaf, we're just polite." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and unhurried, the starched hem of her apron whispering against her legs. The restaurant fell dead silent in her wake. Forks clattered to a halt. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Everyone had heard, not the words perhaps, for not everyone spoke Russian, but the tone, the unyielding command that rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Glasses paused at lips. Eyes followed her path to the service station, where she calmly adjusted a linen napkin as if she had merely commented on the weather. In 90 seconds, Daisy Bennett had done what nobody in Nikolai Petrov's world had ever dared to do. She'd publicly exposed him as a classless bully masquerading in expensive clothes, his empire of intimidation cracking under the weight of a single surgical truth. Whispers erupted in her absence, diners leaning across tables, voices low and urgent, some smiling in quiet vindication, others exchanging glances that spoke of shared outrage. In the far corner, an elderly couple exchanged a nod, and the man began to clap slowly, his palms striking together in deliberate rhythm. One clap became two, then a tentative ripple from nearby tables, building into something electric, a chorus of restrained applause that chased Daisy back to the kitchen. Nikolai sat there, fork still dangling, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, the remnants of his steak cooling untouched. Isabella stared at her plate. Julian cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in his phone. And what happened next would prove that intelligence and dignity will always triumph over arrogance and wealth. But that confrontation was only the spark. The real firestorm, the $400 million betrayal that would topple empires and rewrite Daisy's fate, was just igniting in the shadows of that very table. Nikolai would never see it coming. Neither would she. Nikolai sat frozen at table 7, his fork still hovering like a relic from a battlefield he'd just lost. The steak on his plate had gone from rare to room temperature, forgotten in the haze of his unraveling composure. Isabella shifted in her seat, her emerald gown catching the low light, one hand pressed to her lips as she fought a smile that threatened to break free. Julian, ever the opportunist, wore a mask of genuine concern, though his eyes darted like a predator sensing blood in the water. Isabella couldn't hold it in any longer. In English, her voice laced with barely suppressed amusement, she said, "Nikolai, I think you just got schooled by a waitress." Nikolai snapped at her in Russian, the words a whip crack of fury. "Shut up." The exchange hung in the air, brittle and exposed, until Mr. Henderson materialized at the table's edge, his face a portrait of corporate terror, sweat beading on his brow, tie slightly askew from his frantic dash across the floor. "Mr. Petrov," he stammered, voice pitched low and apologetic, "I am so deeply sorry for the disruption. Ms. Bennett will be disciplined immediately, fired on the spot if that's what you require. Please allow me to make this right." Nikolai held up a hand, the gesture sharp enough to halt Henderson mid-bow. For a moment, the billionaire's eyes were distant, replaying the waitress's words, her accent slicing through his defenses like a scalpel through silk. "Leave her alone," Nikolai said finally, his tone flat, almost weary. Henderson blinked, confusion etching deeper lines into his forehead. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, I don't under." She was defending herself. Nikolai interrupted, switching to English now, each word measured as if testing its weight. "I was rude, leave her." The manager retreated backward, bowing slightly with every step, as if navigating a minefield. The power dynamic at table 7 had reversed in an instant, not with violence or volume, but with a quiet concession that no one in the room had anticipated. Nikolai Petrov, the man who crushed careers over a lukewarm espresso, had just extended mercy to the very woman who had dismantled him. Daisy, meanwhile, had retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of a stainless steel counter. The adrenaline crash hit like a wave, her mind racing through the fallout. The lost job, the unpaid bills, her mother's insulin slipping further out of reach. She decrossed a line, spoken truth to power, and in doing so likely torched the fragile bridge between survival and the street. She braced for Henderson's summons, the inevitable termination, the end of her shift in disgrace. Instead, something unexpected was unfolding back at table 7. Nikolai stared at his plate, the truffle shavings mocking him from their glossy perch. Julian checked his watch for the third time, his half-smile now a thin line of impatience. "Nikolai," Julian pressed, leaning forward with the false urgency of a confidant, "we need to finalize the Riverside acquisition tonight. The documents are in Russian, your lawyers prepared them in full. We sign at midnight or the deal evaporates. The sellers are already jittery." Nikolai waved him off, distracted, his voice a murmur. Yes, later, the Riverside acquisition. A $2.3 billion real estate colossus that would crown Nikolai the undisputed king of Manhattan property, absorbing 15 blocks of prime waterfront along the Hudson into his empire. His lawyers had toiled for 6 months, drafting ironclad terms, negotiating every comma. Everything was ready. The wire transfers queued, the press release embargoed, the champagne chilling in some executive suite downtown. But what Nikolai didn't know, what nobody except Julian Thorne knew, was that buried deep within those 847 pages of dense Russian legal text lurked a single venomous clause. Clause 47B, environmental liability. That innocuous line, slipped in like a Trojan horse amid boilerplate recitations of zoning variances and tax abatements, would saddle Nikolai with personal responsibility for 3 decades of industrial pollution leaching into the soil and riverbed. Toxic drums from long-defunct factories, groundwater contaminated with heavy metals, Superfund-level remediation that experts pegged at a staggering $400 million in cleanup costs alone. And Julian Thorne, the trusted partner who had reviewed every draft with a nod of approval, had penned it himself. His signature flourish on the sabotage, timed perfectly to trigger post-signature, when escape would be impossible. The betrayal was elegant in its cruelty, a financial guillotine disguised as partnership. Julian sipped his wine, hiding his satisfaction behind a concerned frown, the briefcase of documents resting innocently under the table like a sleeping serpent. Daisy didn't know any of it yet. She washed her hands at the sink, splashing cold water on her face, oblivious to the trap coiling tighter just beyond the kitchen doors. But the threads were aligning. The insulted billionaire, the scheming advisor, the waitress with ears attuned to secrets in a foreign tongue. How would she stumble into the heart of it? And when she did, would her unlikely alliance with Nikolai save his fortune? Or seal her own fate in the crossfire? At 10:47 p.m., as the restaurant prepared to close and the last diners lingered over digestifs, something unusual happened at table 7. The hum of the obsidian room had softened to a murmur, silverware cleared, candles guttering low, the bar drawing the stragglers like moths to a flame. Julian and Isabella had slipped away moments earlier, murmuring excuses about fresh cocktails, leaving Nikolai alone with the remnants of his meal and the weight of the evening pressing down. He had spread the acquisition documents across the table like a battlefield map. Hundreds of pages in dense Russian, bound in sleek leather folders, their edges crisp from the printer that afternoon. Nikolai signed them mechanically, pen gliding over signature lines with the rote confidence of a man who trusted his lawyers implicitly, trusted Julian Thorne like a brother in arms forged in hostile boardrooms. The Riverside deal was his crown jewel, the capstone to a career of conquests, and midnight loomed as the deadline to seal it. Daisy approached to clear the plates, her tray balanced with the quiet efficiency born of 8 months' drudgery. The half-eaten ribeye, the cooling foie gras, the smudged wine glasses, all destined for the dish pit. "Excuse me, sir, may I?" Her words trailed off as she glanced at the sprawl of papers. One page caught her eye, splayed open amid the chaos, its Cyrillic text leaping out like a warning flare. She froze, plate trembling slightly in her grip, the world narrowing to those black ink clauses. Remember, Daisy Bennett wasn't just fluent in Russian. She had spent 2 years immersed in its labyrinthine legal terminology for her thesis on aristocratic property laws, the arcane statutes of czarist estates, the convoluted deeds that preserved fortunes through revolutions. She could parse Russian legalese better than most attorneys, spotting the traps in footnotes where others saw footnotes. And in that moment, she saw it. Clause 47 be the trap. Nestled amid recitations of easements and appraisals, it slithered into view. A retroactive environmental liability clause, shifting the burden of decades-old contamination onto the buyer's personal assets. Nikolai, not his company, not insured. Him, her mind raced, the words blurring into a silent scream. Environmental liability, retroactive 30 years, personal guarantor. Oh my God, this would bankrupt him. 400 million in cleanup, toxic sludge from forgotten factories, lawsuits from regulators, a black hole that would swallow his empire whole. All because someone had buried it deep in a language meant to blind him. She stood there, plate in hand, staring at the document, the restaurant's ambient clatter fading to white noise. Nikolai, sensing the pause, finally glanced up from his pen. In Russian, without lifting his eyes fully, he asked, "Is something wrong?" Daisy hesitated. This man had humiliated her an hour ago, his barbs still stinging like salt in a fresh wound. She could walk away. Let him sign. Let the ink dry and watch her tormentor's world implode in a cascade of audits and indictments. Revenge served cold on a silver platter. No one would blame her. The universe might even applaud, but Daisy had a choice. Stay silent and mirror his cruelty, or do what her grandmother had taught her on those long Bronx evenings, poring over faded ledgers. Be better than the people who hurt you. Rise not by pulling others down, but by refusing to stoop. She set down the plate with deliberate care, the porcelain clicking softly against the linen. Then in that same aristocratic Russian, careful as a surgeon's incision, she said, "Mr. Petrov, I don't mean to interfere, but..." "Have you read Clause 47B on page 394? Nikolai finally looked up at her, his pen hovering, suspicion etching his features like frost on glass. In Russian, sharp and edged, he demanded, "Why do you care?" Daisy met his eyes, unflinching, the weight of her decision settling like armor. She replied in Russian, her voice steady, each word a lifeline tossed into the dark. Because that clause makes you personally liable for environmental damage from the last 30 years. Retroactive penalties, full exposure, no corporate shield. Cleanup could cost hundreds of millions, maybe more. Nikolai's expression changed in an instant, brows furrowing, then snapping wide as the implication hit. He snatched page 394 from the pile, his eyes devouring the text, the pen clattering to the table forgotten. Line by line, the betrayal unfolded in stark black and white. His face went white, the color leaching out as if drained by the very words he read. The man who had built billions on instinct now looked like a cornered animal, recalculating alliances, enemies, the very foundation of his trust. The trap was discovered, laid bare under the soft glow of the restaurant's pendants. But would Nikolai believe her, this waitress who had already upended his evening once? Would pride blind him again, or would gratitude forge an unlikely bond? And what happened when Julian returned, briefcase in hand, expecting signatures and champagne, only to find his scheme exhumed at the 11th hour? The night was far from over, and the stakes had just skyrocketed from personal slights to financial Armageddon. Nikolai's hands trembled as he rifled through the document, page after page flipping like accusations in a windstorm. The fine print, once a mere formality, now loomed as a labyrinth of deceit, each clause a thread in a noose tightening around his throat. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the restaurant's chilled air, his breaths coming in shallow bursts as the enormity sank in. $400 million, not in profit, but in ruin, all hidden in the language he had assumed was his ally. He muttered to himself in Russian, the words tumbling out like gravel underfoot. How did I miss this? How could I have been so blind? Daisy stood there, still holding the empty tray like a shield, her own pulse thundering in her ears. She had ignited this fire, and now it raged unchecked. But something in her grandmother's lessons stirred again, the duty to illuminate, not just to wound. Quietly, in that same cultured Russian, she said, because it's written to be as convoluted as possible, layers upon layers of sub-clauses and cross-references designed to drown the eye. Whoever drafted this knew you wouldn't read every word. They counted on your trust. Nikolai paused, his finger stabbing at the offending page, and for the first time that night he looked at her, really looked. Not as the waitress who had eviscerated his ego, nor as an interloper in his domain, but as a woman whose gaze held no triumph, only a steady, unflinching clarity. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, mirrored back his own vulnerability, stripping away the armor of his billions. In that gaze he saw not pity but partnership, an equal who had just handed him his salvation. Who wrote this? He demanded, his voice a low rumble edged with dawning fury. My lawyers, or... The question hung unfinished as Julian Thorne re-entered the frame, sauntering back from the bar with 2 fresh scotches in hand, Isabella trailing a step behind with her phone glued to her ear. Julian's steps faltered the moment he caught sight of them. Nikolai hunched over the papers like a man dissecting his own autopsy, Daisy rooted beside him, the air between them crackling with unspoken alliance. Nikolai's expression, pale, predatory, sent a ripple through Julian's practiced poise. Nikolai, Julian said, his tone laced with cautious concern, setting the glasses down with a forced casualness. Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Nikolai rose slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate, almost ritualistic, page 394 clutched in his fist like a warrant. He straightened to his full height, towering over the table, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet timbre that carried the weight of boardrooms broken and deals dissolved. Julian, explain Clause 47B to me, in detail. For a fraction of a second, Julian's mask slipped, the cool financier's facade cracking to reveal the raw panic beneath, eyes flicking to the page, then to Daisy, then back. He recovered with the speed of a man who had rehearsed alibis in his sleep, forcing a chuckle that died in his throat. That's standard environmental protection language. Boilerplate, really. Your lawyers insisted on it, compliance with the latest EPA regs, nothing more. Why? Did something catch your eye? My lawyers didn't write this, Nikolai said, his words slicing clean through the lie. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen still glowing from the call he just ended in the shadows of the kitchen pass. You did. I just called them. They have no record of this clause, no drafts, no approvals. Dead silence descended, thicker than the velvet drapes lining the walls. The remaining diners had trickled out, but the staff lingered in frozen tableau, busboys with half-cleared trays, the sommelier polishing a glass that gleamed like a witness. Isabella lowered her phone, forgotten, her eyes darting between the men like a spectator at a duel. Nikolai Petrov had made his fortune not just by reading markets, but by reading people, the micro twitch of a negotiator's eyelid, the hesitation in a rival's handshake. And in that moment, he read Julian Thorne perfectly. The averted gaze, the shallow breath, the fingers curling into fists at his sides. Betrayal etched in every line. "You were going to let me sign this," Nikolai continued, his voice steady now, laced with the cold precision of a verdict. "Let me take on 400 million in liability, personal, unbreakable. Then what? Wait for the lawsuits to swarm like locusts. Buy out my shares at fire sale prices when the banks called my loans. Take control of my company, my legacy, while I drowned in cleanup crews and courtrooms." Julian didn't deny it. He didn't flinch or fabricate. He just stared, the color draining from his face, his half-smile twisted into something feral. For 10 years, he had played the loyal shadow, building Nikolai's portfolio brick by invisible brick, only to be dismissed as financial advisor in every toast, every memo, every power lunch. The resentment had festered unspoken until it poisoned the well. "You've been calling me financial advisor for 10 years like I'm some employee on payroll," Julian said coldly, his voice shedding its veneer at last. "I built half your portfolio. I sourced the deals, mitigated the risks, turned your hunches into billions. I deserve to be a full partner. You never offered, not once." "So you decided to destroy me," Nikolai replied, the words not a question but a confirmation, heavy with the sorrow of shattered trust. Julian's gaze slid to Daisy then, contempt flaring like a struck match. "I would have succeeded if your waitress hadn't played hero, sticking her nose where it didn't belong." Nikolai stepped closer, invading Julian's space, his presence a wall of restrained thunder. The air between them hummed with the promise of violence held in check by cooler calculations. "Get out," he said, each syllable a blade. "You have 10 seconds before I call the police for attempted fraud. Wire transfers, forged drafts, I have the logs. You'll rot." Julian grabbed his coat from the chairback, shrugging it on with jerky motions, his eyes burning with the hatred of a plan undone. He backed toward the door, heels clicking on the polished floor, then paused at the threshold, turning for one last parting shot. "You'll regret this, Nikolai. I know things, weaknesses, the kind that topple kings." "I already do," Nikolai shot back, his voice steady as granite. "I regret trusting you." The door swung shut behind Julian with a finality that echoed through the emptying room. The restaurant staff watched, stunned into statues, Mr. Henderson clutching a linen napkin like a lifeline, the bartender frozen mid-pour. Whispers would circulate for weeks. The night the Titan fell, not to regulators or rivals, but to a betrayal unmasked at Table 7. Julian Thorne would be arrested 3 days later on multiple counts of fraud, securities manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud. Federal agents would raid his Tribeca penthouse at dawn, seizing servers and shredders, unraveling a web that stretched from Manhattan lofts to Cayman accounts. He'd served 4 years in federal prison, emerging a shadow of the man who once whispered fortunes into existence, his hedge fund dissolved, his name synonymous with cautionary tales in corner offices. But for Daisy Bennett, the night was just beginning. The confrontation had rewritten the evening's script, toppling one villain in a blaze of justice, yet leaving her standing amid the wreckage, unfired, unbowed, but uncertain. Nikolai turned to her then, the documents scattered like fallen leaves, his expression a complex map of gratitude and intrigue. What reward awaited the woman who had saved his empire twice over, once with words, once with wisdom? A tip wouldn't suffice. A job, perhaps. Or something far greater. A door cracked open to a world she had only served, now beckoning her inside. The underdog's tale was far from over. It was ascending. The obsidian room had emptied out, the last echoes of clinking glasses and murmured farewells fading into the hush of closing time. Only Table 7 remained occupied, a solitary island under the dimming chandeliers, where Nikolai Petrov and Daisy Bennett sat amid the scattered documents like survivors of a shipwreck. The air between them hummed with the residue of confrontation and revelation, the weight of unspoken debts pressing down. Nikolai leaned forward, his broad frame suddenly diminished, and asked her humbly in Russian, his voice stripped of its earlier bluster. "You saved me from losing everything tonight. $400 million, my company, my name, gone in a signature. Why, after what I said to you, you could have let it happen. Watch me burn." Daisy met his gaze, her hands folded in her lap, the tray long forgotten on a nearby stand. In the same flawless aristocratic Russian, she replied, "Because being better is a choice, even when people deserve consequences. My grandmother taught me that. She lost everything in the revolution, family, home, fortune, but she never let bitterness twist her. She chose grace. So did I." Nikolai exhaled slowly, the tension uncoiling from his shoulders like a released spring. He sank back into his chair, gesturing to the empty seat across from him with an open palm, an invitation laced with uncharacteristic vulnerability. Daisy hesitated, the invisible line between server and served still etched in her mind, but then she sat, the linen of her uniform whispering against the upholstery. For the first time that night, they were equals at the table. "I was unspeakably rude to you," Nikolai continued, switching to English now, his accent thicker with emotion. "In my language, the one I thought was mine alone, I called you a peasant. I made fun of your mother, your hands, your life. I reduced you to nothing because it made me feel tall. He paused, the word catching in his throat like a stone, unfamiliar and heavy on his tongue. "I'm sorry, truly." Daisy's eyes welled up slightly, not from weakness but from the sheer exhaustion of the evening, the emotional whiplash of insult to intervention, the raw nerve of her mother's fading voice on the phone that morning. She blinked it back, her voice steady despite the tremor. "You have no idea what it's like to be invisible, to serve people who don't even see you as human, just hands delivering plates, a shadow refilling glasses. Night after night you swallow it down because the alternative is the street." Nikolai nodded, his gaze dropping to the table, tracing the grain of the wood as if searching for absolution there. "You're right, I don't. I grew up poor in Moscow, sharing a single room with my parents and two sisters, winters so cold the pipes froze solid. I clawed my way up deal by deal, betrayal by betrayal. And somewhere along the way I became exactly what I hated. The people who looked down on me from their dachas and limousines, arrogant, blind, entitled." A pause stretched between them, thick with shared scars, the restaurant's silence amplifying the vulnerability. "You speak Russian better than anyone I've met in America," Nikolai said finally, lifting his eyes to hers with genuine curiosity. "Your legal comprehension, spotting that clause like it was underlined in red, it's sophisticated, precise. What are you doing serving tables?" Daisy offered a wry smile, the first real one of the night. "Paying for my mother's insulin and my student loans. Columbia doesn't give full scholarships for master's programs. Not when you're the first in your family to go and the bills stack up faster than the credits." "Columbia," Nikolai echoed, leaning in intrigued. "What's your field?" "Slavic linguistics. I'm writing my thesis on aristocratic dialect evolution in 19th century St. Petersburg Russian, the subtle shifts in phonetics and vocabulary that marked class and power." Nikolai's eyebrows raised, a spark of recognition igniting. "You weren't exaggerating about your grandmother. The Volkov's old blood, deep roots." "I never exaggerate, Mr. Petrov." He pulled out his phone then, thumbing through contacts with the decisiveness of a man reclaiming control. He dialed, holding it to his ear without breaking eye contact. "Margaret, it's Nikolai. I need you to draft an employment contract tonight. Yes, tonight, no delays. Position, Director of Translation Services, Sterling Global. Starting salary, $180,000 annually, full benefits package, relocation assistance if needed. Tuition reimbursement too, make it comprehensive. I'll explain tomorrow." Daisy stared at him, her breath catching, the figure floating in the air like an impossibility. $180,000, a salary that could cover the insulin, the rent, the loans, hell, the future. Nikolai ended the call and set the phone down, his expression resolute. "I do business in 17 countries. Half my contracts are in Russian, joint ventures, mergers, the works. I've been outsourcing to translation services that cost me $300,000 a year and still miss critical details, like Clause 47B amateurs fumbling with footnotes that could cost empires." He leaned forward again, earnest now. "Work for me. Full time. You'll translate every document, every contract, every communication in Russian. You'll sit in on all meetings with Russian clients, oligarchs, diplomats, the lot. You'll save me millions by catching what others miss. Hell, you already have." "Mr. Petrov, Daisy started, her mind reeling, the offer a lifeline she hadn't dared to imagine. "I'm not offering charity," he cut in gently, his voice firm. "I'm offering you what you earned tonight, respect, compensation, and a chance to use that brilliant mind for something bigger than carrying plates. Say yes, Daisy." "Let me make this right." Daisy Bennett had walked into the obsidian room that night with $347 in her bank account, a stack of overdue notices on her kitchen table, and no hope of escaping the grind that pinned her down. She was walking out with a six-figure job offer that would change her entire life, pay off debts, secure her mother's care, launch her into boardrooms instead of back of house. But would she accept? Could she step through the door cracking open before her, trading survival for sovereignty? And what ripples would her choice send through the worlds of power and privilege she was about to enter? The underdog's victory was sealed, but the real story of redemption, alliance, and the empires yet to rise was only beginning. 6 months later, Daisy Bennett's life looked completely different. The woman who once balanced night shifts at the obsidian room with endless study sessions had stepped into an entirely new reality. She had accepted Nikolai's offer that very night, and by Monday morning she was already at Sterling Global headquarters, seated at a sleek glass desk with a view of the Manhattan skyline. The transition was swift and demanding, but Daisy met every challenge head-on. Within just 2 weeks, while reviewing a stack of international contracts, she spotted something no one else had noticed: translation discrepancies that had quietly cost the company millions. Her meticulous audit uncovered $4.7 million in errors, misinterpreted clauses, ambiguous phrasing, and overlooked nuances in Russian legal terminology. When she presented her findings in a crisp, data-backed report, the room fell silent. Nikolai himself reviewed the document, then looked up with something close to astonishment. That single discovery shifted how the entire executive team saw her. Within 3 months, Daisy had become truly indispensable. Her ability to bridge languages, cultures, and complex business interests made her the linchpin in high-stakes negotiations. Nikolai promoted her to Director of International Communications, a role that came with a salary of $240,000 a year. The number still felt surreal to her, more money in one paycheck than she used to scrape together in months. But the real change went deeper than finances. Her mother's medical bills, once an unrelenting weight that threatened to crush them both, were now fully covered by the company's comprehensive health insurance. The crushing debt that had loomed over every conversation disappeared almost overnight, and the cramped apartment they had called home for years, Daisy replaced it with something better. She now owned a bright 2-bedroom condo in a peaceful Brooklyn neighborhood, complete with wide windows, hardwood floors, and space for her mother to rest comfortably. On quiet evenings, Daisy would sit beside her mother's new adjustable bed, listening to the soft hum of modern medical equipment that actually helped rather than just prolonged suffering. Those moments felt like quiet victories. Daisy didn't stop there. She returned to her studies with renewed focus and finished her master's degree at Columbia. When she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, graduating summa cum laude, the applause felt like it belonged to someone else, yet it was hers. Her thesis on syntactic variations in contemporary Russian diplomatic discourse was accepted for publication in the Journal of Slavic Linguistics, a rare honor for a master's candidate. Within weeks, 3 separate universities reached out with offers of fully funded PhD programs, each one eager to have her continue her research under their supervision. She hadn't decided which path to take yet, but the options alone were proof of how far she had come. And then there was Nikolai. What began as a professional arrangement slowly transformed. The sharp-edged billionaire who once dismissed anyone without an elite pedigree learned to listen. Daisy challenged him in meetings, corrected translations on the spot, and offered insights that reshaped deals worth hundreds of millions. In return, he gave her trust, autonomy, and respect. Their relationship evolved beyond titles into mutual respect, a true professional partnership, and eventually something warmer: genuine friendship. Late nights poring over contracts turned into shared laughter over mistranslated idioms or the absurdity of certain negotiation tactics. Nikolai Petrov, the man who had once believed pedigree defined worth, began to see people differently. He started valuing raw intelligence over lineage, insight over connections. He even admitted, in a rare quiet moment, that the smartest person at many tables might be the one no one noticed at first. The most powerful moment came when Daisy returned to the obsidian room. 6 months after that fateful night, she walked through the same heavy doors, this time not in a server's black uniform, but as a guest. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her posture calm and assured. Mr. Henderson, the maitre d', who had once handed her the tray with trembling hands, greeted her warmly by name and led her to a table near the center of the room. Every server recognized her instantly. Whispers moved through the staff like a current. That's her. The woman who stood up to Nikolai Petrov. The one who walked out and won. They watched her with quiet pride, a living reminder that courage could rewrite a story, beautiful resolution. But there's one more twist coming. But Daisy's biggest test came 8 months into her new role. Nikolai had handed her a deal that would either cement her place at Sterling Global or expose her as someone who had risen too far, too fast. An $800 million partnership with one of Russia's largest energy conglomerates, the kind of transaction that could reshape market positions for years. Nikolai was already committed to a critical negotiation in Dubai when he could not postpone. So he made the call that surprised even his closest advisors. He sent Daisy. Alone. No senior oversight, no team of lawyers shadowing her, no safety net. Just her, a slim folder of briefing notes, and the weight of the company's future resting on her shoulders. When she arrived in Moscow and walked into the boardroom, the air shifted. The Russian executives, older men in perfectly tailored charcoal suits, looked up from their documents. Their expressions hardened into something between amusement and disbelief. A young woman, barely 30, no gray hair, no decades of deal-making scars. One of them, a silver-haired chairman with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed, leaned back in his chair and spoke in crisp Russian, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Petrov sent a secretary?" The room stilled. A few of the men exchanged glances, waiting for the young American to falter, to blush, to retreat. Instead, Daisy met the chairman's gaze directly. A cold, measured smile curved her lips. In flawless, unaccented Russian, she answered, "Petrov sent the person who reads contracts better than your lawyers. Would you like to continue underestimating me, or shall we begin negotiations?" Silence swallowed the room. The executives looked at one another again, but this time the glances carried something new, curiosity, perhaps the first flicker of respect. The chairman gave a short nod, almost imperceptibly, and gestured toward the table. They began. Over the next 4 hours, the Russians deployed every tactic in their considerable playbook. They opened with intimidation. Low voices, long stares, pointed questions designed to make her second guess her numbers. When that failed, they shifted to condescension, speaking slowly as though she might not follow the technical jargon. Then came the legal maneuvering, deliberately convoluted clauses buried inside agreements, ambiguous wording that favored their position, attempts to rewrite key definitions at the last minute. Each time, Daisy remained calm. She reviewed documents with the same quiet focus she once used to spot a single mistranslated preposition in a 500-page contract. She marked sections in red ink, pushed back with precise counterpoints, cited Russian commercial code articles from memory, and referenced cultural precedents that even their own legal team had overlooked. She knew the law, she knew the language, she knew the culture, and most importantly, she knew her worth. By the end of the session, the terms had shifted dramatically in Sterling Global's favor. Daisy secured exclusive rights to 3 strategic properties in the Yaml region, assets the Russians had fiercely guarded until that afternoon. She also negotiated concessions that saved the company $47 million in projected liabilities. When the final documents were laid out and the pens came out, the atmosphere had changed completely. The same men who had smirked at her arrival now offered genuine smiles. Handshakes were firm, eye contact steady. As she gathered her notes, the silver-haired chairman leaned across the table and said in a low, respectful tone, "Tell Petrov he found a real diamond." Daisy stepped out of the building into the sharp Moscow cold and dialed Nikolai immediately. The line connected on the second ring. "Deal S done," she said, voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. "They signed everything. $800 million partnership approved, terms better than we projected." On the other end, Nikolai's voice came through warm and unguarded. "I knew you'd handle it. You're better at this than I am." Daisy laughed softly, the sound carrying a trace of disbelief at how far she had come. "I learned from watching people underestimate me." She had traveled a long distance, from the shadowed corners of the obsidian room, where she had been invisible, to the center of an $800 million negotiation, where she had commanded the table. From scraping by on tips and student loans to earning a position that once seemed unreachable. From being mocked in Russian to commanding respect in 17 languages. Daisy Bennett was no longer someone who served others. She had become someone others listened to, someone who shaped outcomes, someone irreplaceable, perfect success story, but one last surprise coming. 1 year after that night at the Obsidian Room, here is where everyone ended up. Isabella Vance walked away from Nikolai Petrov that evening and never looked back. Months later, during an interview with a prominent fashion magazine, she spoke candidly about the moment that had lingered with her. "I respect a woman who doesn't tolerate disrespect," she said. "Daisy taught me something important about dignity. I had spent years performing perfection for the wrong people. Watching her walk out reminded me that self-respect has no price tag." The interview went viral. Isabella's brand grew stronger, built now on authenticity rather than calculated glamour. She never returned to the Obsidian Room, but she carried the lesson forward in every choice she made afterward. Mr. Henderson remained the floor manager at the Obsidian Room. The man who had once handed Daisy the tray with shaking hands, torn between loyalty to his employer and basic human fairness, had changed. The incident forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. Protecting billionaire egos should never come at the cost of his staff's dignity. He stayed in the role, but he ran the restaurant differently now. He implemented new training protocols, emphasized staff rights, and made it clear that no guest, regardless of wealth or status, was above basic respect. During one of the regular orientation sessions for new servers, he stood at the head of the room and spoke with quiet authority. "Remember, you are not invisible. You deserve respect. And if someone treats you otherwise, you have my permission to walk away." The words hung in the air like a promise. The young faces in front of him listened intently. For the first time in years, the staff felt seen. Julian Thorne's story took a darker turn. The hedge fund manager who had laughed at Daisy's supposed ignorance was later convicted of securities fraud. The investigation uncovered a pattern of misrepresentation that stretched back years. He served 4 years in federal prison. When he emerged, he had lost his license, his professional network, his fortune, and whatever remained of his reputation. All of it unraveled because he had underestimated a waitress who could read Russian legal documents with precision. In the end, the same arrogance that once made him feel untouchable became the very thing that brought him down. Daisy's mother, Margaret, found new strength. With her diabetes properly managed and medical bills no longer a constant threat, she regained energy she had not felt in years. She began volunteering at a local literacy program, teaching English to Russian immigrants who had recently arrived in New York. She shared simple conversations, corrected pronunciation, and offered encouragement in the same gentle way she once helped Daisy with homework. The work gave her purpose. Watching her daughter's success only deepened her pride. On quiet afternoons, she would visit Daisy's office at Sterling Global, sit in the sunlight that poured through the windows, and smile at how far they had both come. Full circle. And then there was Alina Volkov, Daisy's grandmother. She had passed away 3 months before Daisy ever met Nikolai Petrov, yet her presence remained constant. On Daisy's desk at work stood a small framed photograph of Alina, young, serious, eyes bright with determination. Every day, Daisy glanced at it. The language Alina had taught her daughter and then her granddaughter, the pride she instilled, the unyielding strength she modeled, those gifts had become the foundation of everything Daisy achieved. One evening, alone in her office after everyone else had left, Daisy touched the frame and spoke softly in Russian. "Grandmother, I did it. I used our language to change my life." Emotional closure. But one final scene remains. 14 months after that night, Daisy stood on the stage at Columbia University to speak about the power of being underestimated. When Nikolai Petrov called me a peasant in Russian, he had no idea he was speaking to a linguist. When he mocked my hands, he didn't know they had typed a thesis soon to be published around the world. When he dismissed me as invisible, he never imagined I would become the most valuable person in his company. Here's what I learned. Being underestimated is not a weakness, it's an advantage. When people don't see you, they reveal themselves. They show you exactly who they are. And that knowledge is power. To every waitress, every janitor, every so-called invisible worker watching this, you are not what they see. You are not your circumstances. You are your knowledge, your integrity, your resilience. One conversation in Russian changed my life. Not because I spoke the language, but because I chose dignity over silence. That choice is available to everyone. Don't wait for permission to claim your worth. The moment someone underestimates you is the moment you gain the upper hand. Stand up, speak your truth, and turn their blindness into your greatest strength. Your power has always been there. Now go use it. But there's one more thing you need to know. Something that happened 3 months ago that nobody's talking about yet. Nikolai Petrov just promoted Daisy to Vice President of Eastern European Operations. Salary, $420,000. Territory, 17 countries. And Daisy's first major decision. She's requiring every American employee to learn basic Russian, because she believes that understanding someone's language is the first step to respecting their humanity.